I'm Annie Bushnell. I use she, her pronouns. It is such a distinct and unusual pleasure for me to be here today to introduce our speaker, Asad. Alfredo Artiles, who's our Director of Research, is away at a conference. He so wishes he could be here. So this event is part of our faculty seminar series, which features new research by Stanford faculty and guests. As I've already said, we're pleased today to welcome Assistant Professor of Sociology, Asad, in conversation with Associate Dean for Clinical Education and Professor of Law, Jayashri Srikantiah. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here and making time for it. Before we begin the event, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. We also have some upcoming events that we want to let you know about, opportunities, exciting things. May 19th is our next faculty seminar series with Dr. Lerone Martin, the director of the MLK Institute and professor of religious studies. He'll be giving a talk on his forthcoming book entitled The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted White Christian Nationalism. And he'll be working with discussant Jennifer Burns from history. April 28th, we have our next faculty research fellowship talk with Anne Charity Hudley of the GSC, the Graduate School of Education, on her new book entitled Talking College, Making Space for Black Language Practices in Higher Education. And she will be in conversation with Guadalupe Valdez. Announcements abound. Thank you so much again for being here. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Very excited to be here to be in conversation with Asad. My name is Jayashri Srikantiah, and as you know, I'm the director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at the law school, and I'm also the associate dean for clinical education. And my legal practice with students focuses on representing detained immigrants who are fighting their deportation, and also systemic challenges to detention and deportation. So paper is very much in the center of the kind of work that I do, and I'm very excited to talk to Asad. Let me just briefly introduce Asad, and I'll turn it over to him to tell you more about his project. As you heard, he's an assistant professor in the sociology department. His scholarly interests include social stratification, study of race, ethnicity, and immigration. Very exciting news about his book with Princeton University Press, which is about to come out, and it describes a 5-year study of Latino immigrants in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'm very excited to see it. And Asad is also the author of a number of other fantastic scholarly articles at the intersection of immigration, race, social stratification, and ethnicity. He's received numerous awards. It would take me the rest of our time to summarize all of his awards, including from the American Sociological Association and others. His PhD is from Harvard, and he's a wonderful colleague, and we're just so excited to hear from him about his work. So I'm just going to turn it over.
For that graciously short but kind introduction. I very much appreciate always having the opportunity to be in conversation with you. One thing I have to note is that Jayashri has been an interlocutor of mine since I've arrived on campus. She's been very generous with being willing to be in conversation with me. She also saw an early version of the book manuscript. So I'm very grateful to be in conversation with Jayashri again. And I also appreciate Amy and Annie and Heidi and Pravita and everyone else at CCSRE for all of the work that went into putting this on, and to all of you for being here today. It's a strange time. I think Obama's on campus.
What?
Yeah. Oh, surprise. So it's funny, this is the second talk I've given at the same time as President Obama. And so often I feel like we're simpatico in that regard. But in any case, I look forward to being in conversation with you all. So this presentation, as Jayashri hinted at, emerges from a larger project, which is my book manuscript that draws primarily on ethnographic and interview-based data with about 28 Latinx immigrant families in Dallas, Texas. I will not be talking about that book today, but I will be talking about one implication from that book, which is set just in Dallas County, but I wanted to study whether some of the dynamics that I identified in Dallas, Texas might manifest nationally. using national data. And so that's what we'll be talking about today as we think about the threat of surveillance alongside the threat of punishment. So much of my work begins from the premise that surveillance and punishment are endemic to modern societies. I don't think I need to convince anyone here that no one is immune to state punishment or surveillance, but their burdens reflect pre-existing axes of inequality. So a growing body of research on surveillance and system avoidance suggests that individuals worried about state punishment are likely to avoid what are known as surveilling institutions. So it's a bit of a jargony term, but it generally just refers to the kinds of institutions that keep records as a matter of law. So you might think of hospitals, the workplace, banks, and even schools. And this research generally finds that much of this research is based on national data and statistical analyses, much like the presentation today, but I promise we'll all get through it together. And it generally focuses on people with criminal legal involvement, so people who have criminal records often. And the general way it operates is that it compares people with a sanctionable status, so a criminal record, to people without. And it looks for differences in educational, labor market, hospital participation, and even having a bank account. And if it finds differences in the rates of involvement in these institutions between people with and without a criminal record, this research tends to conclude that this is an example of system avoidance, that people with a criminal record avoid record-keeping institutions because they fear getting punished again by going into these spaces and being tracked by the records that these institutions create. Now, I think this research is important. I think it highlights a mechanism through which state punishment can create or even worsen existing forms of inequality. But as I argue in the paper, with, by the way, I should say, a wonderful graduate student, Livia Bayer-Basaitis, who is a wonderful collaborator on this project, I think that this research suffers from two limitations that short circuit our knowledge in this space. And the first is that it tends to infer the mechanism from the independent and dependent variables. So what does this mean? It means that it puts a lot of weight on people having a criminal record and infers that because they have a criminal record, they should fear these institutions. But in that regard, it views the threat of punishment as inherent to having a criminal record, rather than inherent to something else outside of the individual or the way that the state has marked that individual. So what I argue is that it's missing a measure that operationalizes the threat of punishment that people with and without that criminal record might encounter in daily life. And that correlates this external source of surveillance to the threat that people might encounter in their daily lives. So I might have a criminal record, but what it looks like to have a criminal record in, say, New York City, where there are high rates of low-level policing on the streets, might differ from having a criminal record and living in a place like, I don't know, Helena, Montana, where perhaps there's not as much low-level policing happening on the ground. And the second concern, and this is a related concern, is that this literature is curiously aspatial. So hinting at what I just mentioned, it suggests that what a sanctionable status means to the individuals who have them is stable across place. Now, although some research has looked at neighborhood characteristics as mattering to this dynamic, so how the racial composition of my neighborhood or the crime rates in my neighborhood matter for the observed relationship between having a criminal record and my institutional involvement, little of this work actually takes the extra step to think about how forms of surveillance external to the neighborhood might also matter for the forms of surveillance that people worry about in their day-to-day lives. And so what we're thinking about in this paper is these characteristics of a place that are related to surveillance and how it matters for how people understand the kinds of surveillance they expose themselves to in places like hospitals and banks and schools and the workforce. So in this article, we term this idea the siting of surveillance. We say that the siting of surveillance is one mechanism that mediates the relationship between what it means to have a sanctionable status, so for example, a criminal record, and being involved in institutions that keep formal records. And so the siting of surveillance, we define as place-based variation in the monitoring and sanctioning of subordinated populations. And we'll clarify what that means in just 1 second. But we argue that this citing of surveillance is an under-examined feature of place that can both enable and constrain institutional involvement among groups that have reason to fear punishment from state authorities. And we argue that attention to the citing of surveillance would help us to clarify the conditions under which a punishable or a sanctionable status, like a criminal record, circumscribes subordinated populations' life chances. Now, a core idea from this research on surveillance and system avoidance is that non-state actors, doctors, teachers, bankers, social workers, and so on and so forth, matter for the forms of surveillance that people encounter in these different institutions. But the fear is not of the doctor. The fear is of the police that the doctor might call. The fear is worries that police might roll through a hospital just because they happen to be there for something else. And that might lead someone with a criminal record to avoid that particular institution. And so policing in particular is a core source of worry in this literature, although it is seldom explicated as such. But one thing that I think we all know in this room is that policing exists outside of these institutions. Police monitor people's homes, the roadways they drive on, the neighborhoods they inhabit, their relationships with the larger community, and so on and so forth. And we know that policing's burdens are falls unequally on poor people and racial and ethnic minorities, which is evidenced by their disproportionate rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration relative to higher income and white people in the United States. Now, policing scholars offer two primary explanations for this disproportionality. The first is what we might call hyperpresence of policing in poor and minority neighborhoods. So this hyperpresence stems from various policing models that emphasize what is known as preemptive policing. And so there are dozens of models here that I can't get into each one, but this generally means that you tend to find places in areas with higher shares of racial and ethnic minorities because the police identify these spaces as hotspots of crime and criminal activity. But this is not because these models are capturing crime rates or criminogenic behavior, but in fact, they're capturing correlated conditions of socioeconomic adversity in the United States that are in this country racialized. And so it's for that reason you tend to find police in neighborhoods or areas that have higher concentrations of racial and ethnic minorities. But this perspective overall suggests that as policing increases in a place, we should expect to find more racial and ethnic minority residents there, right? Because they tend to overlap. So if hyperpresence is about where the places where policing is most likely to occur, then overactivity is about the consequences of hyperpresent policing on the racial and ethnic minorities in these spaces. And the research here is unambiguous, it's super clear that however you cut it, people who live in racial and ethnic minorities are sort of neighborhoods with large concentrations of racial and ethnic minorities experience all kinds of negative consequences associated with low-level policing, higher rates of stress, higher rates of avoiding sort of public places, higher rates of any negative outcome that you could possibly imagine. The research shows that to be clear. And so all told, this policing research, I think, suggests two larger questions that we seek to answer in this study. First, is there generalizable evidence to suggest that findings from this research matter for the character of surveillance across place, and that how policing operates across the country matters for how people engage with surveilling institutions? And second of all, if we do find such a relationship, what specific aspects of policing matter for the relationship across place, for the relationship between holding a punishable status and becoming involved in surveilling institutions? So to answer these questions, we are drawing on the case of the racialized policing of immigrants in the United States. Now, research on surveillance, and you all won't be able to read this, unfortunately, but these are two excerpts from two of the foundational articles on surveillance and system avoidance. And they're both based on people with criminal records. And then in the conclusion, you tend to find a sentence or two that says, and also we expect these dynamics to work among undocumented immigrants too. But nobody tests it, nobody evaluates it, it's sort of uncritically thrown out there. And people have sort of just accepted it because it makes sense, right? It sort of makes theoretical or intuitive sense to a lot of the people who are working in this space. But in fact, a core result from research on immigration policing is that what it means to be an immigrant worried about importation varies markedly across place, as well as the policies and practices that govern these forms of immigration policing. And so immigration policing, we argue, offers a racialized mechanism of surveillance that's useful for this analysis because it disproportionately affects Latino non-citizens in the country. But it also affects Latino US citizens, as well as either through their social relationships or through their possible misrecognition as either undocumented or otherwise vulnerable to deportation because of the racialization of immigration enforcement in this country. So we use this case to test two broad hypotheses about the relationship between surveillance and system avoidance. So inspired by the hyperpresence perspective, we argue that we hypothesize that as immigration policing increases in a county, so too should the likelihood that you find Latinos involved in surveilling institutions there, because policing overlaps in places where Latinos are generally involved in daily life, and that's what we should expect to find according to this hyper-present perspective of policing. And because of the racialized nature of immigration policing, we should expect this to happen regardless of whether someone is sort of part of the broad category of Latinx in the US or different subcategories, US born, naturalized, and non-citizens, and so on and so forth. And that it would be, and if we find evidence in support of this, we would expect to see evidence in support of the racialization hypothesis. So once we figured out where Latinos are, what the counties in which Latinos are involved in these different institutions, we take out all of the counties that say, or where no involvement was found. We say, among the places that have Latinos involved in daily life, we hypothesize that immigration policing should depress their rates of institutional involvement. And that's aligned with the overactivity perspective, that once you find out the places where Latinx people live, higher rates of policing in those spaces should decrease their involvement in these institutions owing to fears of surveillance and punishment. And again, that should manifest across these different subcategories of Latinx people, whether they're citizens or foreign-born or non-citizens and so on and so forth. To evaluate these hypotheses, we use data from the American Time Use Survey. So I promise there's a lot of data here, but it's actually much more, I think it gets more straightforward once you've gotten through the setup. So the ATUS is fielded each year by the US Census Bureau, and it's known as a time diary study. We'll talk about time diaries in a second. But it's a cross-sectional study, meaning that each person is only interviewed once, but it regularly selects respondents from a random subset of households who are finishing up with a larger population survey known as the current population survey. And what's great about this data set is that it includes oversamples of Latinx households and of households with and without children. So when you include things, what are known as sampling weights, to account for the way that the sample was designed, and who responded and who didn't, you get a representative snapshot of how Latinx people, regardless of where they live or in the United States, how they're faring according to these dimensions captured by the time use study. So it's a statistically representative account of everyday life. So the American Time Use Survey uses time diaries, which I just mentioned. And the time diaries document where and how respondents who complete the time diaries spend their days. So in each household, each person is asked to catalog all the activities that they did from 4 a.m. the day before the interview to 4 a.m. the day of the interview. And so many of us probably sympathize with a lot of these respondents that between 4 a.m. and 4 a.m., what are you generally doing? You're eating, you're working, and you're sleeping, and you're watching TV. And the same thing is on display in these data. Most people spend 60% of their time sleeping, working, and eating in the United States. But it's these sort of variations that we see outside of these particular moments that are really of interest in this article. So these data include several details about each activity: who was there, how long you did it, who you were with. And then researchers recode, reclassify all the activities into 17 major categories, which we generally repurpose for education, healthcare, medical, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about it in a second. So there are many advantages, I think, to using these data, especially as a way to approximate daily life in a way that's not typical in quantitative research. But its activities include a broader range of activities than you might otherwise capture if you just say, like, does the person go to the hospital? Have you been to the hospital in the last year, right? Which is the typical, or do you have a bank account, which are the conventional indicators here. But one limitation of these data is that we actually can't account for situations where someone might have health insurance, for example, but then didn't end up going to the doctor in the last 24 hours. And so by that regard, what we think is we have a conservative portrait of what institutional involvement looks like, because there are probably more people involved outside of that 24-hour period than we can capture in the data. So we have three main dependent variables, and they align with everything that we talked about in the lit review, which the first is what we call a binary or yes/no indicator for whether a county has any Latino adults involved in daily life, involved in these surveilling institutions. And so the different institutions are listed here: medical, financial, educational, and labor market. And there's a lot of text here, but let me just tell you that there's nothing here that would surprise you. So going to medical appointment or medical involvement would look like you went to a doctor's appointment, or you called a healthcare provider, or perhaps you went somewhere to pay a medical bill. Financial involvement looks at things like, did you talk to a bank teller, whether or not you have a checking account? Did you withdraw money from an ATM? Things like that. Educational includes things like attending class, going to a seminar, conference, things like that. And then labor market means, did you go to work, or did you go to a conference associated with work? So it's a range of activities, and it's more than just like, did I go to work this day, but how long were you at work, and who were you there at work with? And we find that about 25% of Latinos in a typical county in a typical year are involved in surveilling institutions when looking at it in this regard. So this is sort of the first presence, hyper-presence perspective that we're looking at. But now we sort of drop the counties that have zero involvement. So we saw that 25% of Latinos are involved across counties in a typical year. We sort of take away all the counties that don't have any of this involvement. And we say, among these people, among these counties, what do the rates of involvement look like? So here we're measuring intensity. And so we're looking at the county year. So for each year for each county, the estimate of the proportion of adult Latinos who are involved in at least one institution. And then we also look at how much time they spend in these institutions. And so generally, among the counties that have any Latinos involved in these institutions, about 71% of Latinos are involved in surveilling institutions. And they spend about 439 minutes, it's about 8-9 hours, involved in these, or either traveling to or involved in these particular institutions. All right. So I'll jump over this slide, but for those of you who are statistically inclined, we have a lot of counties, a lot of observations. This is good news. That means that we're able to detect statistically significant effects because we have large numbers of counties and years for each subgroup of Latinos. But our main analysis will be this top category, sort of looking at Latinos holistically. But I'll also provide estimates from each of these sub-analyses. There's going to be a lot of pictures rather than numbers, so that's going to be great. And so what you're going to find is that the results are generally as we might expect, but with some important exceptions. Our key independent variables, so our measure of surveillance are what you might call detainers, data on immigration enforcement, that comes from TRAC, which is the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse University, who they obtain via litigation every year, data from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, on all of their activities that they did in the previous year, and then TRAC makes these data publicly available to researchers. They're a wonderful bunch. So if you're looking for data on immigration enforcement, feel free to reach out to them. They're very responsive and very eager to have these data used by a cross-section of researchers. So a detainer is generally just, it's sort of, it sounds fancy, but it's really just a notice, a hold request that the Department of Homeland Security gives to local police. So someone is arrested, and then that person is fingerprinted. Those fingerprints are run through various law enforcement databases. And then DHS or ICE gets a match. And then they send an email or a notice to the police department saying, hold on to that person for 48 more hours beyond when you're going to release them. And we may or may not punish them. Now, a locality, a police department may or may not comply with that request. But what we argue is that this is a good measure of what policing on the ground is doing, in that local police are arresting people that ICE suspects are non-citizens and also removable from the country. And so it's less an indicator of what the DHS is doing and more an indicator of what local police are doing by capturing people in their local communities who ICE might want to deport. All right. So this is the weird thing about immigration enforcement in this country. Some places are notoriously punitive and some are notoriously just absent on the deportation rates. So we see this in our data too. There are a lot of counties that have 0 detainers each year, and there are some counties that are somewhere over 18,000 detainer requests each year. But the average is about 371. And so this is what you call skewed data. And so we do a typically, I mean, we sort of just take the logarithmic value of this and add 1. It just makes it more interpretable and more manageable to navigate in our data analysis. So any good statistical analysis has a bunch of control variables that might also be correlated with the measures or the relationships that we're trying to estimate. So here we're including all of the things that existing research tells us we should include, things like the size of the county, the change in the size of the county population, whether it's growing or not, the size of the population that's foreign born, the size of the population that's Hispanic, the change of the Hispanic population over time, the county's GDP, its annual percentage point change in GDP, and at the bottom we also include a measure of how much money each state spends on policing. And all of these are sort of factors that the research tells us we should anticipate as moderating our analysis. So we're going to include them in our statistical results. You may think about things like, why is there not crime rate here? Why is there not, like, whether the place is Republican or Democratic in terms of who it votes for? The answer is a lot of these factors are highly correlated, and so they make estimation a bit more complicated. But I will say the results are somewhat similar, are very similar when including and excluding these different measures. All right. So you've all done such a great job so far, but we have one last complicated slide to get through. All right. And it's the analytical strategies so that we can understand a bit of what we're doing in this article. But as you no doubt guessed, we're using stats. But I think it's important that we're on the same page. So the model we're using is called a double hurdle model. And it generally assumes that an individual's decision on how much they participate in an activity results from 2 different processes. So the first process is what you call hurdle 1. So in this first hurdle, we determine whether an individual participates in an activity at all. So here's a straightforward example. Some people don't eat meat. And so if we had data on meat consumption and we saw a lot of zeros, you'd say, oh, that person didn't eat meat that day. But it could also be that the person is vegetarian or vegan. And so those zeros are more meaningful than just a 0, right? They tell us that some people just don't eat meat at all. And so we want to account for that in our analysis. And in the second hurdle, we demonstrate the extent of participation, the extent of a person's participation if that person is not 0 type. So in the case of people, in the meat example, some people are meat eaters. And so among meat eaters, we look at how much meat eaters eat. All right. So one is about figuring out who's at zero and why they're at zero. And one is about figuring out for the people who are not at zero, how much they're participating in a particular activity. So in our case, we're looking at whether a county has any Latinos involved in surveillance institutions. And then among those counties that have any of this involvement, we're looking at how involved they are. All right. Okay. Now come the pretty graphs. So this graph summarizes one of our core results for the Hurdle 1 model. So how involved people are, the likelihood that a county has any Latinos involved in a particular surveillance institution. So the bottom, you have the number of ICE detainers. On the left, you have the probability of them being involved. And then the red bars are when you don't include the control variables, and the blue bars are when you include the control variables. We're only going to interpret the blue bars together today. But for those of you who are so inclined, you can see what adding the control variables does as you move from left to right. So moving from left to right, you generally see that the blue bars are increasing as immigration enforcement increases. What does this mean? Is that substantively, about 16% of Latinos in counties with 0 detainers are involved in surveillance institutions in a given year. This rate doubles in counties that have 100 detainers. It increases again to about 45% in counties that have 1,000 detainers. And it climaxes at about 59% in counties that have 10,000 detainers. So what this tells us is that immigration policing overlaps with the places where Latinos are more involved in these institutions that surveil them. All right. Now the question is, do these dynamics extend to other categories of Latinx people across the United States? So that's what these next couple of charts are looking at. Now it's smaller, but I just want you to take the general takeaways away. These are for the US born. You're just looking at the blue bars. The blue bars are increasing, same result. These are the foreign born. Blue bars are increasing, same result. These are the naturalized citizens. Blue bars are flat, meaning that immigration policing does not overlap with the places where naturalized citizens are more involved. But again, looking at non-citizens, you see that the blue bars are increasing over time, or as immigration enforcement increases. So what this tells us is that immigration policing overlaps with the places where Latinos overall are involved in daily life, but also with the places where other subcategories, except for the naturalized, are larger proportions of the population involved in daily life. All right. So now we're taking away all the counties that have 0 involvement. We're only looking at the places that have anybody involved. And so the graphs are somewhat similar in the sense that on the bottom, you've got ICE detainers. On the left, you've got the probability of involvement. And we're reading from left to right, looking only at the blue bars. So in the counties that issue 0 detainers, we estimate that about 85% of the Latino population there is involved in at least one surveilling institution. But as you, in counties that have 100 detainers, that share falls to 75%. In counties with 1,000 detainers, it falls to 68%. And in counties with 10,000 detainers, it falls to 60%. So what this tells us is that there is a depressing effect of immigration enforcement on how involved Latinx people are as immigration enforcement concentrates in a place. So this aligns a little bit with the system avoidance perspective, but bear in mind that even at the highest levels of enforcement, you still have about 60% of Latinos involved in daily life, all right, in these surveilling institutions. And again, we've got these smaller graphs here, looking at the US born. We see a similar story looking at the blue bars. Looking at the foreign born, similar story looking at the blue bars. Looking at the naturalized, you actually do see an effect. They do decrease their involvement as immigration enforcement increases in a place, but not for the non-citizens. Their involvement stays flat across these levels of immigration enforcement. And so what this tells us is that perhaps immigration enforcement might concentrate in places where Latino non-citizens are more involved in daily life, but Latino non-citizens do not vary their participation in these activities in response to what immigration enforcement in their place looks like, or at least they don't vary it in as appreciable of ways as we might expect them to given these research. All right. Now we're turning to time. How much time do people spend involved in these different institutions? And as it turns out, the blue bars are flat. That means that for Latinos overall, the amount of time that they spend in these different activities doesn't change, even as immigration enforcement increases, nor does it change for the US born, the foreign born. It does change for naturalized citizens. They do decrease how much time they spend involved in different institutions, but not the non-citizens. And so to us, this suggests that perhaps in context of increased immigration enforcement, even as there are decreases in the proportion of Latinos involved, some Latinos increase the amount of time of their institutional involvement to either demonstrate a lack of fear or a commitment towards securing necessary resources for themselves and their families in spite of the fear that they might be facing in their daily lives. And that's sort of based on existing research that we're hypothesizing this idea. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Great. So now we're having established that surveillance in a person's county matters for how they engage with different institutions that might surveil them. We wanted to see whether there were aspects of that surveillance that reliably predicted or reliably explained these results. And so we came up with three possible explanations. And the first is about the predictability of immigration enforcement. So some of you know this, but there are federal changes at the national level that have prioritized the arrests of immigrants with what are called serious criminal records. We can debate about the semantics behind that. Most of the crimes are not very serious. And yet there are concrete policy changes that we can identify that predict how predictable immigration enforcement is. So prior to 2011, immigration policing was somewhat unrestricted. You were undocumented. If you got caught, perhaps you would end up deported. Probably just a coin flip, honestly. In 2011 or so, John Morton, who was then the director of ICE, issued a memo, which is called the Morton Memo, that sort of started this pivot toward deportation by criminal record. And that policy was formalized in 2014 by the Obama administration in the Priority Enforcement Program. And then, as we all know, in 2017, everything went to hell. And then the Trump administration sort of undid many of these changes and reverted back to 2011 practices of being somewhat indiscriminate in terms of who they targeted. So we use these dates to look for possible explanations for the results that we're finding. So we're looking at low enforcement counties, which we define as 100 detainers, and high enforcement counties, which we're defining as 1,000. And we're looking at each of the different subgroups here. You just need to look at the colors. So basically what we're finding here is that when ICE started prioritizing by criminal record, that's the blue bar, there were decreases in the incidence of Latinos institutional involvement. But when that policy became formalized, these are the red bars, there were no changes in Latinos institutional involvement. And then during the Trump administration, that's the gray bar, you see massive declines in participation in surveillance institutions. So now when you look at the higher enforcement counties, you generally find stability over time. You see that most of the bars are, even if they're positive, they're not statistically significant. Many of them are sort of big, but they're not really telling us a whole lot until you get to the gray bars, where for every subgroup of Latinos, except for the naturalized, you see massive decreases in the incidence of institutional involvement for different categories of Latinos in the US during the Trump administration. And so this to us suggests that predictability matters to some degree, but really it's more about uncertainty than it is about predictability. All right. So the idea that someone can come in and sort of trample how you've understood daily life matters a lot more than I think that predictability element. So here we're looking at the same result, the same predictability analysis, but we're looking at how involved people are. And you find that, for all Latinos and US born, not a whole lot is happening. But on the far right, for the foreign born, you actually see massive increases over time. Predictability matters. But also in the Trump administration, the gray bars, you see that there are increases happening over time as well. To us, and you see something similar happening in the higher enforcement counties. So to us, this suggests that perhaps the local context insulated a lot of people from the threats happening at the federal level. So even as things are going crazy in Washington, local counties, mayors, bureaucrats did a lot of outreach to increase involvement among these different subgroups. All right, so we just looked at predictability, but there's also the possibility that a county can become more punitive over time. It might participate in more enforcement activities over time, might be more scary. Maricopa County, where Phoenix is, might be scarier than Oakland or Alameda County, where Oakland is. All right, so we wanted to test this idea. But we're generally in the low enforcement county not finding any significant effects of increased punitiveness over time. In the high enforcement counties, you see that there's an effect for Latinos overall, suggesting that counties that become more punitive tend to be those where Latinos overall tend to be more involved in surveillance institutions. Again, sort of overlapping with this idea that immigration policing overlaps with places where Latinos are more involved in daily life. And then when you look at the effect on intensity, not a whole lot happening here in the low enforcement county. But you do see a negative effect for Latino non-citizens, meaning that in counties where they're becoming more punitive, where immigration enforcement is more a part of daily life, Latino non-citizens do depress their own involvement in response to this fear. And the final point we want to raise is partial implementation of immigration policing. So sanctuary jurisdictions, which we've all heard of, but generally just mean that there are some counties that limit the cooperation their state or local police have with immigration officers to deport immigrants. It doesn't mean that no deportations are happening because of the local police. It just means that a more restricted set of deportations are happening. Again, usually those that align with serious criminal records. So in low enforcement counties, we're not finding a whole lot of evidence that sanctuary policies matter to the incidence of institutional involvement. And actually, we do find in high enforcement counties a negative effect among the foreign-born generally and Latino naturalized citizens specifically, to us suggesting that sanctuary policies can perhaps be counterproductive when combined with higher levels of immigration policing overall. And so you can't still have high rates of policing and a sanctuary policy for folks to be involved in daily life. One has to give. And when looking at the effect of partial implementation on the degree of intensity, again, you find a positive effect among the naturalized. They're more likely to be involved in the low enforcement counties when a sanctuary policy is in place. And you find something similar in the higher enforcement counties. Okay, so we're nearing the end. But in general, we find pretty good support for our first hypothesis, which is that immigration policing overlaps with the counties in which Latinos are more involved in the institutions that surveil them. And we find support for that for everyone except the naturalized. And then regarding the degree of cooperation, participation, we see that as immigration policing increases in a county, Latinos generally decrease their involvement in surveilling institutions. We find support for this for everyone with mixed evidence for the naturalized. Because they decrease the amount of time that they spend involved, even as they maintain their participation. They decrease both the time and their participation, but the non-citizens do decrease their involvement. And then regarding the possible moderators, we find that predictability, punitiveness, and the sanctuary jurisdictions all seem to matter in slightly different ways. But in general, they tell us that piecemeal approaches to immigration policing can have somewhat counterproductive effects when not combined with a general change in this overall level of policing in a particular place. So our goal here has been to examine how these laws and policies matter for for governing surveillance in a particular place. And we've used immigration policing to think about this a bit more. And our analysis shows how surveillance is cited in counties where Latinos are more involved in record-keeping institutions, but conditional on that involvement, this citing is associated with lower average rates of involvement. So for research on surveillance, our results suggest that we should think a bit more about the scope conditions that may be associated with institutional involvement. And we must also be cautious not to assume the structural equivalence between people with criminal records and people who are vulnerable or worried about deportation. Our consideration of these possible mechanisms suggests that they share a lot of similarities, but there are aspects of immigration policing that operate a bit differently from policing more generally, in the sense that there is a certain legibility, predictability, interpretability about how it works among people who are affected by these policies in a way that someone who has an outstanding arrest warrant perhaps is not concerned with because they are on the run, for example. And we think that generally we need to think about these distinctions from the criminal legal system as we build a theory of surveillance and punishment among people worried about immigration enforcement. And finally, and I'll end here, our goal is to redirect attention to the inequality generating processes of institutional involvement rather than avoidance. So here I'm making a big deal that we find a lot of evidence of Latinos being involved in the institutions that surveil them, and how this could be read charitably to say this is great. We shouldn't be so worried about inequality here. They're actually doing a really good job of becoming involved in daily life despite the threat of deportation. But the fact of their involvement that we've documented tells us nothing about the quality of that involvement, right? And so if you are if you are high rates of involvement in medical institutions, that could be that you're going to your PCP, your primary care provider, all the time. Or it could mean that you're going to urgent care for delayed care or incomplete care, and you need actually more services that you're not getting because you're worried about the threat of deportation in a regular hospital. Likewise, for a bank, it could be really good, or for financial institutions, it could be really good that you have high rates of involvement. But if that means that you're going to extractive payday loan lenders, then it means that we need to be thinking a bit differently about what financial involvement looks like. And finally, when you're looking at education or work, it could be really good that Latinos don't decrease their involvement in work or educational activities in response to immigration enforcement. But if you're working with an exploitative employer or going to an exploitative for-profit institution for college, it suggests a different inequality generating process that we need to be thinking about how institutional involvement can actually be a vehicle toward inequality and not just sort of a way to ameliorate it. All right. So thank you all so much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Asad. As you know, your work is really fantastic, and there are many really wonderful things about this piece. One of the things that I think is really critical here is just from a policy perspective, which is where I come from, as you know, the big question that we are often asked by policymakers is how much do sanctuary laws actually work? So if you're trying to convince a county to enact a sanctuary law, you have to go in there and say, this is really good for Latino residents in your county because it enhances participation in precisely the things that you're talking about, right? Banks and hospitals and the kind of parts of daily life that are that counties generally want to encourage participation in. And so I think it's really important work because it really connects to that question in really meaningful and important ways. And I really appreciate also the way in which we've gone from the Obama years and priority enforcement to the Trump years, and now, I mean, I presume the Biden years, where we're back to some of the enforcement priority that we had under Obama, including the same focus on people with criminal records. So in some ways, this research does a really good job of predicting what we might see now that we're returning to the Obama practices, at least for this period of time. So I think it's important in a lot of really great ways. And also, I would say one last thing, which is just testing that that feeling that we all had during the Trump years when we were talking to people at Stanford Hospital who were saying our waiting rooms are empty. People are really scared to come here to get help because they're getting this message that could cause deportation, even though you had a conflicting message from the county, which, as you know, we're in Santa Clara, which has one of the best sanctuary policies in the country. And there's this real tension of how does that messaging play out? And I think this kind of goes to the heart of that. So I love the paper for lots of reasons. I was wondering, just to start us talking a little bit, and I'd love to hear from all of you your questions too in a few minutes. One thing that I wanted you to talk a little bit about is that there are sanctuary policies and there are sanctuary policies. So you can imagine a county that has, or maybe it was easier things to talk about the other side. You can imagine a county that is very anti-immigrant, that not only has the detainer policy, but also has 287G agreements, which are agreements that allow local police to be deputized to act as immigration enforcement and funding for the federal government to expand the core of people into immigration arrest. So this sort of immigration enforcement on steroids, right, in a county. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how what your hypothesis, how it plays out as these sanctuary or anti-immigrant policies or sanctuary policies on the flip side vary in intensity, and what you expect.
It's a tough question because there are 3,000 counties or so in the U.S., and each county can basically have its own approach to immigration enforcement and immigration policing, as you know. And so what's happening at the border can be completely disconnected from what's happening in a particular county, in a particular region, and so on and so forth. So our measure of sanctuary jurisdiction is actually following David Hausman, who's a PhD graduate of Stanford political science. Also, I think you were on his committee. So the definition that we use sort of approximates David's definition, but expands the database. And so in his definition, it was a county refuses at least in part to cooperate with the full scope of ICE detainers. And so this is a little bit different from 287G agreements because it could just be that there are no detainer requests and these deputized authorities are just deporting folks of their own volition without sort of dealing with the detainer. I would say I'm heartened for a couple of reasons that it's not a huge deal to the validity of the results. The first is that I think at the height of that 287G program, there were only about 80 such agreements. And that was in 2013 or so. They've kind of fallen out of, I don't want to say fashion favor since then. So they're not as prevalent today across counties as they might have been. And even in those 80 counties jurisdictions, research shows that they weren't as, they did contribute a little bit, but they're really sort of a fraction of the deportations that we were witnessing from inside the US. And today, these detainers that we're focusing on constitute about 55 to 60% of all deportations that are stemming from that are happening inside the US. And so I think our measure does a great job of capturing the majority of deportations, or the majority of that, I guess I'll say the process through which a majority of deportations occur, even as we are certainly missing some of these sort of smaller sources of immigration enforcement, like the 287G agreements. But the good news there is that there are tons of data sets that we're merging in now that capture this more multidimensional aspect of immigration enforcement. The big problem with them, though, is that a lot of them are stuck at the state level. And so we're looking to actually just hire an undergraduate RA to help with this work over the summer to create a county level data set that looks at these specific aspects of county policies, including these 287G agreements, how they overlap with the sanctuary jurisdictions and other policies that the Urban Institute and other think tanks have been sort of gathering for us. So we'll see, but my prior is that the character of detainers matters more to how people approach their day-to-day lives than do these other sort of agreements that are a bit less visible. So detainers, I think, offer a good proxy for how people think about policing in their local communities and how it works in a way that the 287G agreements are a bit more opaque. Although certainly if you're arrested and then the police deport you, people will the police department there will develop a reputation for being, in cahoots with immigration enforcement. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah. Complicated. I had lots of questions as you were talking about what was that, but one of them was that one of the things that counties tried to do during the Trump years, when there was both increased federal enforcement and anti-immigrant counties enacting these detainer policies, but pro-immigrant counties not only had the sanctuary policy, which was the anti-detainer or no detainer policy, but also several other programs to enhance immigrant integration and participation in precisely these institutions that you're talking about. I was wondering how that factored in to your analysis.
Yeah, so I think you see that most clearly when you're looking at the predictability analysis. So you all remember that during the Trump years, you see massive increases in all Latino subgroups' intensity of their institutional involvement in the counties where any of them are involved. And my hunch is that it's precisely this dynamic that we're capturing here. So it's not that people say, oh, Trump is so pro-immigrant, let me become more involved in these surveilling institutions. It's actually like, oh, my mayor or my sheriff said, you're good. Go to the hospital, go to the welfare office, go to school, go to work. We're not going to arrest you for that. Like, we're not going to arrest you for driving without a license, even if the state doesn't give you a license. But we will arrest you if, like, you, I don't know, have a felony conviction of some sort that I feel like the typical person, whether immigrant or not, just doesn't have walking around. And yet, so that's the big worry of sort of these staunch, xenophobic rhetoric, right? Like, everyone here is a criminal. Actually, most people are not criminals. But I think that's what we're seeing, that even though the Trump administration was doing what it was doing, that these localities stepped in and actually did a good job of buffering against the sort of punitive federal context.
Yeah, that's actually good to know
Yeah.
and useful for advocacy. I had another question related to that, which is some of the work that I did a conference, worked on a conference a few years ago about red states and blue counties, right? And blue states
In
and red counties,
Yeah.
and versus blue, blue and blue, which is where we are in California, or red and red in some counties in Texas, for example. I was wondering how this might play out, how that matters for what you're talking about. So not the blue, blue, red, red, but the red, blue, and blue, red, situation where you have let's take in Texas, you have a county surrounding Austin, which is a blue county, in a red state, where the red state has put so many restrictions on the county that the kind of anti-detainer stuff they can do is pretty limited. And if that makes a difference, then what about if it's flipped in terms of blue state?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So I'm going to pivot from Austin to Dallas.
Okay.
Because Dallas is a blue county that has in a red state. And that's where I know a lot about sort of Texas politics and research, because that's where my book is based. Certainly the blue county or the blue city in a red state can do a lot to offset what's happening at the federal level. So the mayor of Dallas and even the county sheriff, Lupe Valdez, who right now there's a new sheriff now, but for a long time, Lupe Valdez was the sheriff. And what they did was they sort of said, whatever is happening at the state level, we're not doing that here. And so in my 5 years talking to families in Dallas, Texas, I thought I was somewhere, I didn't know, I thought I was in California, the way that people were talking. They said, oh yeah, that's totally fine. I can go to the hospital, I go to the welfare office, I go to work, I don't ever have to worry about papers, they know I'm undocumented, but I just got promoted to like part-time, to assistant manager at my Jack in the Box and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, but we're in Texas, right? Like, so I just couldn't lose that assumption that the fact that we were in a red state should mean something different for how people were thinking about surveillance and their fear of deportation. And yet they showed me that this dynamic of blue county in a red state matters a whole lot for how they experience this deportation threat. There's I think there are political scientists, Els deGraw, who talks about local citizenship. And you're seeing a lot of that play out in the context of immigration enforcement, that because the experiences across counties are so different, what it means to live in Dallas could mean something very different from living in the neighboring county, Carrollton County, where policing is just much more rampant against immigrants in that particular locality. But to flip it, and if I were to look at a blue state with a red county, I'm looking at Angela S. Garcia's book, so Legal Passing, published by UC Press in 2019. So she did a study of 2 neighboring counties in Southern California, one very integrationist, very pro-immigrant, and one very exclusionary, very anti-immigrant. She found something similar, that in the integration county, life was great in some ways, right? Like, of course, you're vulnerable to deportation, but you have all the state protections, you have all the sort of all the belief that you're going to be fine as long as you don't break any of the laws that you know that you have to break. But there was also a tremendous awareness of the county boundary. Like the second that you cross over into this neighboring county, you're like, oh, the rules of the game are very different here. So I have to be extra cautious. And what Angela shows in that book is that people adopt behaviors or mannerisms associated with what she calls legal passing. People who adopt behavioral mannerisms that help them to blend in as part of like mainstream society, which generally means white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in a particular context. And so that means that women would pull their long hair back into a tight ponytail, put big sunglasses on, because that's what American women do while they drive, or you have a clean car. If you're like landscaping, you make sure your truck stays super clean and you make sure it's as new as possible, because that's what someone who's documented or with citizenship as a landscaper would do. So all these things that people invent to try to sort of stay safe from policing, all these things, I think what they tell us is that the state can do a whole lot, but the state, the state you live in is not destiny, right? So there are undocumented immigrants in all states, all 50 states, and they all find a way to carve out life for themselves in spite of the restrictions that they encounter. And I think a lot of sociologists and other social scientists are beginning to grapple with this idea that, the way that surveillance should manifest among this group based on theoretical priors associated with people with criminal records or other kinds of vulnerabilities are just not, they're just increasingly, they're not sort of passing muster. And so we need to think a bit more broadly about what it means to have this sort of what Cecilia McKeebot calls liminal legality. Even if you don't have a semi-legal status, you're just undocumented in the US. A lot of people are confronted with the idea that I've been here for 20 years. Yeah, I'm undocumented, but I got this far. Might as well keep doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. It's really interesting because, the county difference we experienced. We're in Santa Clara County and San Mateo County was terrible.
Yeah.
Over the years has been very difficult. It's gotten better, but for our clients, where a person was arrested for a conviction that could result in immigration consequences, if that was on El Camino north of Menlo Park versus in Palo Alto, made a really big difference. And it is that local policing policies that we.
Yeah, you see it for COVID restrictions too.
Yeah.
There were bans on indoor dining in Santa Clara County. I had to take my dog to the groomers, and people were living life in San Mateo.
Yeah. For sure. I had a question also. You mentioned that there was one of your hypotheses at the end, or one of your conclusions at the end, was about the degree of participation and the quality of participation. For example, someone who, you were talking about the medical situation, who has to go multiple times to a less good provider for medical care, would show up in a different, maybe in the same way, someone who's accessing those but isn't getting that same quality of services. I was wondering if there's also a clumping effect in terms of the 4 categories that you identified. So you can imagine, let's say Stanford Hospital saying, hey, we have these free clinics. They used to be packed, but they're not packed anymore. And if that's, that could be missed, and not just because people might be going to other medical providers, but also that they could just be not doing the medical stuff at all and going to the bank more to pay for, medicines from the, drugstore or something like that. So I guess I was just wondering if you saw that change.
Yeah. So the analysis that I presented today, basically, let's say there are 20 Latinos in a particular county, and 5 of 20 are involved in at least one of these different institutions. That's the estimates that we generated today. What we're working on now is these sort of sub-institution analyses. We're generating separate estimates for medical and financial and work and so on and so forth to see if the meat of the action was that like, work is always present and doesn't really disappear regardless of what immigration enforcement looks like. But maybe you sort of opt out of medical institutions because you're worried about being outside of the house more than what's necessary. So that's what we're testing now. My guess would be that we're not going to see a lot of traction in the work department. I think research, the ethnographic research shows that even if people are worried about deportation, it's not that they're skipping out on work, right? Sort of work still has become a very sort of necessary to live, and that's why people came here to begin with, right? And so a lot of people are just sort of accepting you might lose your job one day because your employer warns you of an ICE raid, but you're still going to go out looking for work. But I think the meat of the action will be in the medical institutions, and it will be in schooling. Mm-hmm. So even if you have children who are in school, you might sort of avoid parent-teacher conferences when immigration enforcement gets hot in a place because it's an unnecessary trip outside the home, and you know that your kid is doing well, for example. Or you might skip the doctor for yourself, even as you're taking your kids to the doctor because it's necessary for them to get their 5-year vaccines or whatever. And so I think that's really what we're going to see.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel that one of the things that I love about this work and the other work is calling, well, I don't want to say calling out, but really focusing on the sense of taking the invitation of the government to conflate immigration enforcement with criminality, right? Which is definitely the way that like, the Trump administration and other government officials would put it. But if you tease those apart and talk about how they look at differently, there's so many different things. So it's fantastic to hear about that. I'm really curious about that future research too. I was wondering if the flip side of that in areas that are strongly over-policed for Black and Brown communities, what kind of themes you can see? Because it was something I saw a couple times in the paper that you didn't mention on the talk. I wanted to just give you the opportunity to talk about, we know that Black and Brown communities are over-policed, period, putting aside immigration altogether. And then you have your research, which kind of looks at immigration through an immigration lens. And I think if you lay those two on top of each other, there are kinds of things that emerge, which you talk about in the paper. So I wanted to give you a chance.
So there are a lot of figures. I gave you all a lot of figures. There are a lot of figures I did not give. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. We worked so hard on it. So we did what's called the falsification test, right? So it's this idea that if you think that immigration policing concentrates in places where a lot of Latinos live, because it's, and that sort of supports our surveillance hypothesis, that's great. But then you're like, well, what if it's just policing concentrates in places where everyone lives? And so how do we know it's something unique about Latinos who are sort of suffering that racialization? So what we did in the paper is we generated estimates for all white and Black people who live in the same counties as the counties that we included in the data set. And we found a couple of things. Is that one, Latinos across the different subgroups are more involved in all of the institutions than the estimate of white and Black people in all of the counties that we're looking at. And two, not only are they more involved in terms of just sort of the share of people involved, but they also spend way less time involved. And so
way more time
involved. And so it's that it's not that when we look to see whether immigration policing predicts some of these outcomes, we find that it matters for where white and Black people are more involved in surveilling institutions. But we think it's precisely this dynamic, which is that most Latinos concentrate, especially Latino immigrants, concentrate in some of the 20 of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And those also tend to be places that have high shares of Black and white populations, high numbers of Black and white people living there. And so I think what we're seeing there is that immigration policing just tends to exist in places where white and black people live. And there are various reasons for that. One is, policing is an amenity more than it is a nuisance for white people in the US. And two, policing is a nuisance for black people more than it is an amenity for people in the United States. And so in some ways, that's what we're picking up there. But we don't see that immigration policing specifically has an effect on either white or black people's intensity of it. And so there's something specific about immigration policing that's affecting Latinos and the different Latino subgroups, but it's not affecting white and black people, at least in terms of intensity, although it does matter differently for where you find it located.
Talk more about it. That's fascinating
Yeah.
to me. What's your theory? Why?
Yeah.
Why is that the case? How would you explain it?
I think there's a couple of things. So one is just that, where Latinos live, a lot of other people live. And so in the counties that have a lot of Latinos involved in them, you're also going to find a lot of other people who are involved in them. That's just the first thing. The second thing is there's a group threat hypothesis, which is that as in places where there are large concentrations of racial and ethnic minorities more generally, policing exists to offer protection for white people on average relative to black people. And so I think we're picking up some of that dynamic as well. And I think the third thing is that we're just picking up that policing is super active in places where other people are active. And this is just the reality of life in the United States, right? That we hyper-criminalize and hyper-police everything. And that's what we're picking up, that in the places where people are living, and they're living in institutions, they go to work, they go to school, you just find police there because it is such an organizing feature of society that it just affects everyone. It's in everyone's orbit, but it's not affecting everyone. And I think that is sort of the big dynamic that we're capturing.
I'll ask you one more question, and then I'll open it for my question. But one thing that you noted at the end, and that was also in the paper, was about naturalized, the Latinos who are naturalized U.S. citizens, and that the trends were just different. And that sort of jumped off the page and off the slides. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think that number is so different. These are people who were immigrants and who have naturalized, and why is that number so? Why are those that population so different on those different graphs?
Yeah. So just to recap, it's that Latino naturalized citizens. That policing does not overlap with the places where Latino naturalized citizens are involved in the institutions of daily life, but they do decrease their involvement in response to higher levels of immigration enforcement. So for us, to me, that suggests that there's a couple of dynamics at play. One is that where immigration policing concentrates tends to be in places where it's not just sort of any immigrant per se who's involved. It has to be large shares of non-citizens, the undocumented in particular. And the undocumented concentrate in very particular counties and cities in the United States, even as they're dispersing across the United States to other counties. But the decreased intensity, that was surprising. And because naturalized citizens are all but immune to deportation. There's very rare cases of denaturalization, but by and large, that's not really happening on such a grand scale so as to depress rates of institutional involvement. What I think is we're picking up there is a mixed status family effect. And we can't measure that in these data, unfortunately. But if you're naturalized, elsewhere I did an analysis that if you're a Latino naturalized citizen, or a naturalized citizen who is Latino, you are 2 times more likely to have someone in your family who is undocumented relative to a U.S. born Latino who's born in the United States. So I think that's what we're picking up. And so it's probably that they're more inclined to be risk averse relative to the average U.S. born person. And I think that's the big thing that we're picking up, although we can't explicitly test that in these data.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Question. I have a question about segregation within counties. Is your data able to capture some of that? Like Santa Clara County, gosh, I don't know, 78% of all Latinos in the county live in San Jose, right? So is your data able to kind of capture the different, what you were explaining earlier about how different communities you know, for some policing is a amenity, for others antagonistic. I mean, is that kind of difference
Yeah.
captured at all in the data?
So we don't include segregation measures in the data set, although that's a great idea that I think would be very easy for us to do. Those measures exist, and we can easily sort of merge them into our data set. But I will say one thing that we do is add in measures of the changing demographic context in a particular county. So we see how much, if at all, the Hispanic population in a county has grown over time. Now that does not capture what you're describing here, which is that Latino people Latinos who live in the Bay Area tend to concentrate in San Jose, and maybe they commute to work in Santa Clara County. We're not able to capture that dynamic per se, but what we can capture is how places that are becoming more or less Latino over time, in terms of the proportion of Latino residents who are there, how that plays a part. And we find that it does. So you saw that there were red bars and there were blue bars. The red bars don't have the control variables, the blue bars do. And in most cases, the blue bar was shorter than the red bar, which means that when you control for things like these demographic contexts, you actually do explain some of the difference. So it does matter to some degree how Latino a place is or how involved they are in surveilling institutions, but it doesn't explain all of it. And so what we're finding is that even when when accounting for places where Latinos are more prevalent in daily life, like a San Jose, where you might expect higher rates of involvement there, it's not telling us the whole story. That actually, above and beyond that, policing still seems to matter independently.
I have one more kind of follow-up question. You mentioned the phrase life chances, and I just kind of putting it together that we're assuming that participation in surveilling institutions is good, right? And we want them to participate in surveilling institutions, but for citizen and non-citizen communities of color, that's not always the case. The surveilling institutions are a good. There's a lot of problems in these institutions. So I'm wondering if your data captures like informal networks that might be developing and changing and growing and evolving to address some of these, you know, when people are deterred from surveilling institutions, some citizen or not, if those kinds of networks, you know, going to the healer in the community or, you know, just things like that,
Yeah.
I don't know how, if your work might be capturing some of that.
So I think it's a wonderful point. I agree with you. So the existing research on surveillance system avoidance is very uncritical. That like, oh, these surveilling institutions are good and necessary and unavoidable, and it sucks when we see people leaving or avoiding them because they're afraid of punishment. And yet, like, they don't really interrogate that assumption. And I think what we're starting to do here, my hope in this paper is to start to interrogate that a bit more. To say that just because people are involved doesn't mean good things are coming from that involvement. But what you're asking about is that, you know, among people who are avoidant, like, are they going to the healers? Are they getting massages like when their back hurts, or, you know, from the healer in their community, or anybody else in the community who might otherwise occupy that role? We don't know from these data. I can tell you from ethnographic data that others have collected. Andrea Cervantes Gomez, who's at Wake Forest University, she wrote a paper with Cecilia Mejia about these healers in Kansas and how they were actually somewhat exploitative in terms of the ways that they sort of navigated their role in the community. That, you know, not only did they charge high rates, but they also sort of led to a delayed set of care because of a different cultural relationship to medicine that they were arguing mattered for how their respondents understood whether to go to the hospital or to go to the healer. So we can't tell you that based on our data. We just don't, it's not that fine grained. Unfortunately, we can't tell you if they went to a local healer, but we can tell you if they went to, I think we can tell you if they went to a clinic, which we should look at. But I will say that these alternative forms of alternative institutions, these sort of that you're asking about, are certainly very relevant. And unfortunately, we can't really speak to them. But we can speak to other institutions, what Sarah Breen would call a non-surveilling institution. institutions. So we looked at whether the dynamics that we observed among people in surveilling institutions manifested in churches and in their volunteerism. And we actually find that it doesn't. So if people are not decreasing their involvement in churches or in nonprofits or in other sort of volunteer institutions, if anything, they're actually increasing. And so that there's some evidence there in support of the idea that you're proposing, but unfortunately, it's a bit sort of maybe to the left of what you're arguing or what you're asking about. But I think it speaks to your point and suggests that probably people are seeking out these other forms of involvement.
Well, it makes me think too, like what can communities do to support all of those, right? Like surveilling institutions and also these other informal networks through churches or whatever it might be.
Thank you for this talk. It's been very insightful. I have like two questions, and perhaps you could take up both or either or neither. The first one is about this question of local citizenship and like in your work, did you come up? I wonder about the role of like individual institutional actors, right? Like making a claim, right? Like saying like, and you alluded to this a bit, right? Like you'll be good under XYZ circumstances, or actually come because we're trying to alleviate this federal problem that you might be experiencing. I'm thinking of like if that came up around like hospitals or schools, like school principals or other stakeholders. The second question is I'm thinking about the context where I come from in New York is where the category of documented and undocumented are mutually exclusive, but the categories, I think this is true everywhere, of Latino and Black or white are not, right? So then my question is about this kind of the intensity of policing and Latinos who are Black. Do you have a hunch around that in places where, for example, the Caribbean population would be the like dominant population of folks from Latin America?
I can actually answer both questions. So I'll start with the latter question. So we can't speak to it in these data because as good as they are, we just don't have sufficient numbers to generate reliable estimates of non-Hispanic or the Hispanic Black population. Although there was an article in the Atlantic a couple years ago where I don't know where they got these data, but they talked about, I think Jeremy Raff talked about the double punishment of being Black and undocumented. And there he showed that Black immigrants who are undocumented were twice as likely as, or Black Hispanic immigrants who are undocumented, twice as likely to be not just detained, but also deported relative to sort of Hispanic immigrants who are non-Black. And so I think, though we can't speak to it in our data, it's certainly broader dynamics of policing will have a disproportionate effect on Black Hispanic immigrants relative to Hispanic immigrants. In a separate paper that was looking at using the Dallas interview data, we found that a lot of the Hispanic non-Black immigrants that I interviewed as part of my book understood the racial hierarchies of policing in the United States, and sometimes, in their perspective, they strategically opted into majority Black neighborhoods because although they would stand out there as sort of a non-Black Hispanic person or Latinx person, they knew that when the police rolled around those neighborhoods, that the police were not there for them. They were there for all of the crimes that they perceived their neighbors had committed, given correlated conditions of disadvantage and stereotypes in the United States. So I think certainly to be Black and to be undocumented and Latinx would mean very different things from being, non-Black and Latinx and undocumented. The first question that you asked about local citizenship, can you just remind me what the key question was?
Oh, it's just like in your research, were there like proactive steps that institutional actors were making to say like, hey, like come to this school or come to this hospital or come to this other surveilling institution?
Yeah. In Dallas, I can speak very clearly about Dallas. The answer is unequivocally yes. So after Trump won the 2016 presidential election, the mayor released a really impassioned letter, sort of urging everyone that don't worry, like whatever happens in Dallas, you're going to find a safe place, even though it's not like our official sanctuary jurisdiction as far as I understand. You can go to school, you can get all the resources that you need. The sheriff and I are working together and blah, 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 and you're gonna be okay. So certainly that happened. There was a lot of door-to-door knocking from police officers in Dallas. It was this community policing model, which you would think you wouldn't do if you're worried about.
I don't want them knocking on my door.
If you were worried about like your undocumented residents, but a lot of people I talked to appreciated it. They said, yeah, the police came by and told me not to worry. I was like, oh, I don't know that I would have opened that door.
They do it on the speaker.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think would have been worse. So yeah, I mean, certainly, and principals and teachers are all very active. There's a lot of these frontline, I can't say frontline workers anymore because of the pandemic. There's a lot of these like people-facing workers, like teachers and social workers who do a lot of heavy lifting in their local communities to tell people these are the resources that you can get, even if you're undocumented. And I think one good thing about Dallas County is that a lot of the hospitals and even the welfare office, or a lot of the hospitals have social workers on staff who then will like meet with someone and say, oh, you just gave birth, great. Here's CHIP for your kid, Children's Health Insurance Program, if you don't already have it. But a lot of even the regular social work offices, even caseworkers, will just really encourage people to apply for different benefits. Prenatal care if you're undocumented and pregnant and so on and so forth. In a way that I think lessens some of the pressure, the fear. But on the other hand, I think as I argue in the book that hopefully you all will hold in your hands next year, is that it creates sort of a coercive effect in the sense like, okay, if I don't take these benefits that the social worker is telling me to apply to, are they going to think I'm a bad parent and my kids are not vulnerable and they're going to call CPS and the cops on me? So it creates this double bind of like everyday surveillance that they're worried about, even as they're really worried also about this long-term final form of surveillance that the police and ICE and immigration judges will give them should they end up deported. So the answer is local citizenship is great, but it doesn't do everything. It's all very complicated.
Not that, should we, I don't know how.
Mine is a peripheral question.
Oh,
So we
right.
can- Maybe out of respect for people's time, maybe let's close it. You can ask afterwards. But
Thank
thank
you
you
so
so much for coming. Yeah. And now you get a chance to eat.
Yeah.
More questions.